My name is Philip Heedy. I'm product manager for ArcGIS Enterprise, and with me I have my colleague Shannon Kaliski,
Hello, everyone.
Also product manager for ArcGIS Enterprise. So you might wonder right off the bat, why are we going to be talking about something that also involves ArcGIS Online? That's okay, we're all friends. It's true. So we want to know a little bit about you before we get started. This is an interesting session. It's actually one of my favorite sessions that we've done here for the past couple of conferences, because we get a chance to talk about more than just our own product, more about the ArcGIS platform as a whole and how to try to fit some of the different parts together. It's also an interesting presentation because I have a tendency to do very low-level tech-focused presentations. This one I get to be a little bit more high-level. I enjoy that. But that also means that I don't necessarily have the same feel for your backgrounds. So by show of hands, and tell me afterwards if you completely disagree with my categories, how many of you think of yourselves as GIS analysts, meaning you work daily or at least regularly with things like ArcMap, maybe ArcGIS Pro, doing traditional GIS work? Show of hands. Most of you. Okay. Now, just because you raised your hand once doesn't mean you can't also raise your hand for other categories. How many of you work with installing the software? Excellent.
So many hats.
So pretty much all of you do both. That's good, right? You like that. Multiple hats. How many of you think of yourselves or work in a capacity where you're also trying to define the architecture, the holistic view of how the ArcGIS platform is used within your organizations? You guys do everything. Excellent. Well, you're in the right session. I'm very glad. That means we have content that pretty much tries to span that entire spectrum. So I think that's the first time I've ever had most of the room raise their hand on every single category.
I know, that's a good mix.
It's actually kind of fascinating. So,
is it anyone's first user conference? Anyone? Welcome! I'm so glad you're here.
Yes,
this is very exciting.
So, Shannon and I have what we think is a really, really interesting session, because what we're going to try to do here is take some of the ideas, the concepts that you heard Jack talk about yesterday in the plenary and make them a little bit more concrete about, well, when we talk about Web GIS. Now this is an interesting one. By show of hands, how many of you could define what we Esri mean when we say Web GIS?
I can do it.
See? Hopefully by the end of the session, you'll all raise your hand on that one. If not, come up and tell us why. So when we talk about Web GIS, the focus of this session is to give you an idea of how to make that real. What is a Web GIS? What do we mean when we use that term? And more practically, what software do I install? What capabilities do I get? What's the point? That's really the gist of what we're trying to do in this session. So the way that we want to do that, I want to try to take a step back initially and put Web GIS, the concept, in a little bit of context. What came before it? How is it different from what you've been doing for the past many years? And when we think of Web GIS, it's really part of this evolution of GIS itself. For many of the attendees here at the user conference in particular, GIS, what's that synonymous with? Probably ArcMap. We have a user conference survey that goes out every year. You should all have received it and hopefully responded. And I think the last number that I saw was that 97.6% of the attendees at the user conference use ArcMap. To me, that rounds off to 100. Everybody uses ArcMap. Many of you also use other technologies that are part of the ArcGIS platform. Our server technology has been around for well over a decade, and previous iterations of that. So you may have heard of or even used things like ArcIMS, ArcGIS Server. All of those things fold up and work with the desktop software. The idea of web services is really not new. We've been doing web services for quite a while. So the desktop software has always had this very close relationship with the rest of the platform, in this case, whether it was IMS or in more recent times, things like ArcGIS Server. Web GIS is the next evolution beyond that. It's about not just talking about web services, REST endpoints. Who here is an IT person who loves their REST endpoints in JSON? Oh, come on. See, this is where you're not supposed to raise your hand. I always make the joke that the people who speak REST and JSON are the developers. Now, I'm a reformed developer, so I sympathize. I love my JSON just as much as the next person. But most end users do not, right? Normal users, normal, that's a bad phrase. People who are not building maps or GIS applications themselves generally don't think in terms of REST endpoints and JSON. And on the other hand, they use applications that we've built from Esri side, whether it's Collector, Survey 123, Navigator, things like that these days, applications that business partners have built and that you're using with the platform, or in many cases also applications that you yourselves have built. So Web GIS is an overarching concept of ours that tries to capture all of the infrastructure that's needed to power such a modern application-based GIS platform. All right, I'm still at the high-level fluffy stuff. I promise it gets more concrete. So when we look at the ArcGIS platform in an incredibly oversimplified fashion, but hopefully useful for the purposes of this presentation, we think of it more or less like this. On the left-hand side, we have ArcGIS Desktop, whether that's ArcMap or Pro, hopefully Pro coming up soon. That feeds into one of two systems. There's ArcGIS Online, and then there's ArcGIS Enterprise. For those of you who are new to the ArcGIS Enterprise branding, there's other sessions where we talk much more about that. Shannon, you have a session called ArcGIS Enterprise, an introduction, and when is it?
Later today at 1:15.
Sometime after lunch here.
Yeah.
For those of you who haven't yet attended the upcoming session or heard more about this, ArcGIS Enterprise, for now, think of it as the continuation of ArcGIS Server and Portal for ArcGIS, those components that you may be familiar with. So those are the two products that embody the infrastructure and the capabilities that we mean when we talk about Web GIS. And that powers all of those applications I just talked about. It also powers the application infrastructure that you can build upon when you are creating your own applications, whether it's things like story maps, configurable app templates, all the way down to creating your own native or browser-based applications using our APIs and SDKs. So this is how we think of the platform. For this presentation, what we're really focused on is that middle part. Because how do you choose? Everywhere else, it's fairly straightforward. I have desktop, fine. ArcMap, Pro, apps, great. How do I pick which one of those two things in the middle that I want or need? That's what we're going to talk about. Oh, no, I messed up my...
I just saw that.
Oh, shit. Animations. This is why you always go through in presenter mode before. So let me do this. Ruin my animations. What came before, in many cases, this is a question we get on the ArcGIS Enterprise side. Well, how is this Web GIS thing different from what came before? Haven't we been doing web services for a while? Haven't we been creating applications for years? How many of you have had Flex Viewer or Silverlight Viewer applications, right? I have my own hand up. I used to do a lot of that myself. So how's this new thing different from that? I've been publishing map services. I've been creating browser-based applications for a while. Well, one of the challenges we often saw in what I'll term server GIS, which was more the raw, I publish a web service and then somehow I consume it, was that we had an idea of reuse. This was a great idea and it's valid in many ways, but what happened was often that we saw a set of requirements come in. We need this kind of application for these users, and they're going to be running in, let's say, a browser. And they need to look at this set of data, these layers, and so forth. And we build up the stack of services to support it and that application. And then what happened? Steve Jobs came around and told us all that Flex was going away, and it wasn't going to work on iPads, and we were all very sad. Now, I was a Silverlight guy, so that really never worked for me anyway. But nonetheless,
I was Flex.
The requirement came along that maybe that same application, or maybe even a slight variation, we need that on a tablet. Or we need it on some other type of device that we can't support. So what did we end up doing? We had to build a new application for a new environment, for a new device of some kind. And because it was slightly different, instead of reusing those other web services, in many cases we had to publish a slightly different variation. It wasn't quite the same set of layers. Maybe there was a slightly different set of scale dependencies, definition queries. Something was just different enough. So instead of getting reuse, we built up another stack. And then came along, well, it just so happens we don't just need it on an iPad, we actually need it on that Android tablet as well. So now you get to recreate the same application for the third time for yet another device. So it's not that the server GIS pattern was never successful. It obviously was. We all spent a lot of time and energy and solved a lot of great problems. But we want to tackle that fundamental challenge of having to recreate applications all over the place for different devices, for different form factors. So with the Web GIS pattern, that's really what we tried to do. Instead of having to create new services, create new data sets to support all these things, we wanted to create a single unifying application infrastructure. Now, that's me as an IT person getting a little bit geeky about things. But to a large extent, that's what it is under the hood. Instead of having to deal with publishing new services all the time, we tried to abstract some of that away. We introduced these ideas of web maps, web layers, that are more configurable. And most importantly of all, those web maps, those web layers, scene layers and so forth, web scenes, they can be used by any device, anywhere, anytime, because we've taught the entire set of ArcGIS applications and anything built on top of our APIs and SDKs how to work with this higher level of abstraction. So you design that web map once, and the applications that run in the browser, on an iPad, on an Android tablet, whatever it might be, all know how to display that same map at the same fidelity with no loss of accuracy. So now you can start reusing those different components across devices, across applications for many different purposes. And you have a way to manage all of those things. It's no longer the realm of server administrators, but you have an entire content management-like system for your GIS assets. So all of that goes into what we think of in the Web GIS pattern. So that's a bit of motivation for why couldn't we just keep on doing the thing we've been doing with things like server for a long time. So I want to talk a bit more about applications before moving on with Web GIS. We have a whole spectrum of tools. I touched on this a little bit already. And it's really important to understand that this pattern is not all just about the applications that Esri we provide. Now, there's a tendency when you come to a conference like this that, well, we talk a lot about the apps that we build because it's an Esri conference. But just because we've built Collector and Survey and Workforce and Navigator, and there's so many I can't even list them all out anymore, doesn't mean that we have solved every single version of your problems for you. There's going to be many different applications that we have not yet built. So as part of the WebGIS thought is also this idea of app templates, configurable apps, things where you can go and very quickly get something stood up. Instead of having to build a JavaScript application from scratch and get your developers to do that. We offer a whole lot of choices for self-service mapping and creating applications out of that. We continue to add more templates and more configurable applications with each release. It's a spectrum, so it continues on. Many of you have those slightly more advanced needs, but that doesn't mean you necessarily want to create applications from scratch. So we also have app builders. If what you need to do doesn't fit within a template, you can go a step further and create your own application using things like Web App Builder or App Studio. Now, how many of you are developers? Wow. It's a very eclectic mix of you're doing GIS analysis, you're installing, you're developing. You guys must be busy. As you move across the spectrum, there are, of course, also cases where you need to build completely custom applications. You have a very specific need. You have a very specific audience in mind, and you need to be able to customize the entire experience. And we have a wealth of APIs and runtime SDKs for that. The JavaScript API is the premier way to build browser-based applications, and then we have runtime SDKs for virtually every single native device and platform under the sun, whether it's iOS, Android, Qt, Java. I've lost track. So all of those things work within the platform. Do not think that it's just about Esri has built collector, so now I shouldn't ever think about doing anything else. But we'll touch on how to make those choices. What is the deciding factor between using a ready-to-use solution versus customizing something that's there and so forth. We'll talk more about that here later in the session. All right. How many of you have seen this diagram before? It's impressive. I expected everybody to raise their hand. This diagram has been used for several years now, I would say. And it's an interesting one because what is the most prominent feature on this diagram? It's that fluffy cloud in the middle, the portal. And I think Jack said this yesterday at the plenary. He has that at recent conferences. That portal thing's pretty important. And for many of you, it's also going to be the new thing compared to what came before. Do you already have a portal or not? And how does that come to life? So let's talk about what that actually means. When we dissect this diagram, there's multiple parts to it. One is what I just talked about, the applications and, of course, the users of those applications. We won't touch too much more on that besides what I've just said. Then the next part is that portal itself. How do I get one of those? What is it? What do I need to do? That's really the main focus. Connected to the portal is also a GIS server of some kind. Something has to sit in front of your data, whether that's enterprise geodatabases, file geodatabases, or I'm not judging, shape files. And then, of course, there's a whole suite of content and data that we provide through ArcGIS Online, and that you can also download in many cases and install in your own infrastructure if you so need. So base maps and what we term utility services. So we'll really focus on that lower portion of the diagram, the portal, the GIS server, and that data, and how does that all fit together? How do I get the right combination of things from the different products? So let's start attacking that. How do you get a portal? Well, there are two main ways that we provide. There's two products that make this whole abstract Web GIS concept come to life. There's ArcGIS Enterprise and there's ArcGIS Online. The defining characteristic of ArcGIS Enterprise is in many ways the fact it's software. Software that you install, maintain, configure, upgrade, all those good things. And ArcGIS Enterprise itself contains a portal. Also contains a lot of other components. But if you're familiar with previous releases of the software, you'll have heard of the portal for ArcGIS software component itself. That's a part of ArcGIS Enterprise. Because it's software, you get to take a release when it comes out every 6 to 12 months. We just had a new release here a few weeks ago, ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5.1. How many of you have upgraded to 10.5.1 before coming here to the user conference? I don't know what to expect with the hands anymore. I'm very impressed. I wish we had prizes to give out. That's a fairly unusual answer. 2 weeks after release. One of the characteristics of software is that, well, we need to plan for that. We need to figure out when to do an upgrade. We need to test staging environments and so forth. It's not unusual for us to see adoption rates along the lines of a quarter of our customer base having upgraded after 6 months, which leaves the last 3 quarters to upgrade sometime between 6 to 24 months to never. On the other hand, ArcGIS Online is SaaS, software as a service. ArcGIS Online also just had an update here a couple of weeks ago. How many of you upgraded to the latest release of ArcGIS Online if you use Online? All of you. You came in, you pressed F5, and magically there it was. It must be nice. We work on the software side. It doesn't quite work like that for us. So there's a characteristic there that might push you towards one or the other. Many organizations these days, well, SaaS sounds awfully attractive, right? I don't need to install, I don't need to do anything, it's there one day. But what's an advantage to one organization might be a disadvantage to somebody else. As it turns out, many of you have internal training materials. So what was part of the latest update to Online was also a UI refresh for many of the pages. That meant all that training material just became out of date. But you had no choice. You got the upgrade whether you wanted it or not. So there's an interesting dynamic of, well, I'd really avoid having to run my own infrastructure, install software, to, well, I still want to adopt things at my own pace. There's a little bit of a tension there. But when you look at the two products, they have the same core Web GIS functionality, if you will. They both have a portal. They both have a browser-based map viewer, the ability to create web maps, to share them, to control access based on groups and identities and so forth. And they both provide the underlying infrastructure that all of those applications we talked about can sit on top of. So if you want to use Collector, you can use ArcGIS Enterprise or ArcGIS Online. That's part of the core set of capabilities. On the ArcGIS Enterprise side, because it's software that's running in your infrastructure, we have some additional capabilities for doing integration with your existing systems. If you're running LDAP or Active Directory, well, we can connect directly to that. On the ArcGIS Online side, well, Online is not running in your infrastructure. It doesn't have access to your LDAP or AD, as an example. But we do other types of integration using protocols like SAML, what we call enterprise logins. But that means you have a slightly different feature set between the two. Depending on the type of integration you need to do, you may be leaning more towards the enterprise side rather than Online. It all depends on what functionality you're looking for. On the Online side, we have single sign-on, like I said, using SAML. And then, again, on the ArcGIS Enterprise side, we have what I've termed advanced GIS functionality because I couldn't fit anything more on the slide. There are some practical considerations to take here. Advanced GIS functionality is an awfully vague term, but it covers a lot of different things. You've probably seen some of the demos yesterday, such as Insights for ArcGIS. It's a new application that came out late last year. Right now, that falls under the ArcGIS Enterprise side of things. There's not an online version of that yet. There's also advanced GIS capabilities, geoprocessing, doing your own custom geoprocessing tasks. That's something you can do with ArcGIS Enterprise. Whereas in ArcGIS Online, there's a more limited set of analysis tools available. If you fall in the category of somebody who needs the full 800 to 900 GP tools, that might push you towards ArcGIS Enterprise. And then there's image server, Geo Event Server, Geo Analytics Server, all these other capabilities that we have sessions covering throughout the week. On the other hand, ArcGIS Online comes with a few terabytes worth of base maps, content from the Living Atlas, and so forth. It also comes with what we term utility services, routing, geocoding. I'm not going to ask anymore because you guys raise your hands at the most unexpected times, but I'm going to venture a guess that most of you don't have a worldwide routing service available internally, because that takes a lot of data. It takes a lot of servers to power it. On the other hand, in ArcGIS Online, there's such a service available, and you can use it and simply pay for what you use. If you need to do a few routes, that's fine. It costs a credit or two, and you saved yourselves a 6-month implementation project. So again, there's pros and cons to each. So let's move on and talk a bit about the anatomy of this portal thing itself. The magic of online, again, is it's just there. How did we implement it? Well, that's really beside the point, isn't it? It's software as a service. You go to arcgis.com, it just works. You don't need to concern yourself with the underlying servers, the infrastructure, the databases, and whatnot going on behind the scenes, because we have a team in Redlands and other teams across the world that take care of running that system with, I think it's 99.9% uptime. That's the SLA. It's a pretty good SLA. I would venture to say that most IT departments cannot meet 3 nines. They may have a goal, but rarely meet it. On the other hand, there are IT departments that want 5 nines and are willing to pay for it. That's a crucial aspect. In that case, well, you will have to run your own system. We don't guarantee that. We'll give you 3 nines. So if you want to set up a Web GIS in your own infrastructure, now we're talking about ArcGIS Enterprise. And because it's software, you need to install some software components. We have multiple components, not just one thing. There's Portal for ArcGIS, there's ArcGIS Server, there's ArcGIS Data Store, and then the unsung hero that's not actually listed here, there's this web adapter thing we also keep talking about. And they all need to be put together in the right way. We saw yesterday, Julia did a great demonstration during the plenary of the new ArcGIS Enterprise Builder. Make it easier to install all of these different software components and configure them together. But then there's a whole spectrum there as well. But that's what you're signing up for when you're doing software. So just again to put a little bit into perspective for those of you who use ArcGIS Server today is the server GIS infrastructure you had before, or still have. There's ArcGIS Server, and then in many cases your enterprise geodatabase, files, shape files, goodness, it happens. That doesn't go away because you still need those same web services. You still need all of that data to be available. What's new is the addition of this additional infrastructure on the left-hand side, the portal, the hosting server. That's a new concept that you need to become familiar with, and then some of that other software. So what you have today is not a waste. It doesn't go away. It simply gets an even more important role in the bigger picture. So without getting into all the details on this, I'll just plug 2 sessions. And it's not just because Shannon's doing one and I'm doing the other. It's because they're really important. The ArcGIS Enterprise and Introduction session goes into a lot more detail on ArcGIS Enterprise, the product itself, but also talks about some of those advanced GIS capabilities I mentioned. And if you are that IT person who needs to install the software, understand how it all fits together at a very in-depth level, how do I scale it out? Do I need 1 machine? Do I need 12 or somewhere in between? We have the Architecting Your Deployment session on, it's tomorrow.
And we do have an intro session on Friday as well in the morning. So after you go to the park party, if your plane is delayed and you just think, I need more conference and I need more enterprise, Thomas Edgehill and I will be giving that ArcGIS Enterprise and Introduction section at 9 a.m. on Friday.
You get to do it 3 times.
3 times.
Wow.
So nice. We intro it thrice.
All right.
Yes. It works.
That's enough plugs for ArcGIS Enterprise. We may be a little bit biased there. So let's get to the meat of this. I talked for so long already, I'm not even there yet. This is really where I think it gets interesting, and this is where I want to leave you with as much information, as many thoughts as I can to really help you on this journey of deciding, well, how do I pick? Do I pick ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise? Or is it really not a choice between the two? Can I use both?
You could always pick on how charming the product managers are. We're quite charming.
We think so.
Paul and Kelly are also quite charming, though.
On one side, we have what I personally think is the less interesting pattern. There's just ArcGIS Online. But what's really attractive about this pattern? Well, I didn't have to do anything to get here other than get an online organization. You talk to your account manager, customer service, whatever magic it is that happens, and now it's there. You didn't have to install any software. You just logged into arcgis.com and there you were. That's amazing. That's a very, very easy, simple, quick way to get started with all of those applications that I mentioned that depend on having a Web GIS of one kind or another. You can start using Collector today simply by going into online, and there you go. So what we see is a lot of newer customers have a tendency to go here. Start here, get their feet wet, use all of these great new features, and then I think they'll discover that they need even more great GIS capabilities and start also using ArcGIS Enterprise. What we see, on the other hand, is a lot of customers like yourselves, most likely, and I'm basing that on some of your answers, start here from the other side of the spectrum. You already have ArcGIS Server, and maybe you even have Portal for ArcGIS from some of the previous releases, meaning you're really already using ArcGIS Enterprise, the full stack. And it's running in your infrastructure. I didn't really touch on this yet, but what does your infrastructure mean? Well, it just means anywhere that you can install software that you maintain or somebody maintains on your behalf. ArcGIS Enterprise can run anywhere software can be installed. We run on Windows and Linux, and as long as you have the right system requirements in place, which is some number of gigabytes of memory and some hard drive space and whatnot, you can run ArcGIS Enterprise. It's not just for quote-unquote on-premises. It doesn't have to be under your desk or in your basement. I personally run it under my desk, so I think that's actually a great way to do it. But it can also be in the cloud, whether that's public clouds like AWS or Microsoft Azure, or whatever other cloud provider that you might be using. And that's an important thing to understand because there's a lot of confusion about this. Well, Esri doesn't support IBM soft layer. No, we do. What we don't necessarily have is specific tooling for just that particular environment, but it's fully supported to run there. We have other deployment options, Chef, one of the things that Julia also mentioned in her demo yesterday. If you can install it, it's supported. The question is how easy it is to install. That's a different question. What we often see is, even though you're running the software in your own infrastructure, wherever that infrastructure may be, it's not really, in many cases, disconnected from the open internet. Sometimes it is. But more often than not, what we see is actually this slight hybrid pattern. You might be running ArcGIS Enterprise in your own infrastructure, but you can reach out to the open internet. You can make use of base maps from ArcGIS Online. That's probably the most common thing to do. I'm running my own software, my data is behind my firewall, but base maps come from online. Or those other utility services. I'm running my own software, but I will not stand up my own world routing service, and that's fine. Make use of the online data, content, and services whenever it makes sense. So that's what this second pattern from the right is trying to show. And then there's probably what I consider the most interesting pattern of all, where we've been doing a lot of work over the past couple of releases to really tightly integrate ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise. And that's the one thing that I want you to remember from my part of this session, which is that it's not a choice between one or the other. You can absolutely use both. Now, when would you choose to use both? There's lots of different reasons why we see customers ending up in this pattern. One thing is, well, when you're running things in your own infrastructure and you want to collaborate with somebody external to your organization, whether it's contractors collecting data on your behalf or you need to make data available to the general public, lots of variations. But, well, you don't want to give that contractor a domain account, VPN access. That just takes too long, or maybe you just can't. The approval process alone would take you months. So instead of giving them access to your internal system, maybe they can simply get access to your online site. It's on the open internet. There's no domain account to provision. There's no VPN to worry about. They can simply access your ArcGIS Online organization, collect the data, and then you can bring it back down. Do your QA, QC internally if that's how it works within your organization. So we see a lot of potential here, and we're doing a lot of work to make this even easier. You've been able to do many of these things in the past by simply automating and scripting things, but we want to bring the ability to work tightly between the two systems into the core product itself. And that's a big part of our 10.5 and 10.5.1 release for what we call collaboration, or distributed collaboration in particular. So we'll talk much more about that in other sessions. So really, that leads me to this staircase diagram of the evolution. None of these evolutionary steps replace what came before it. They build on top. ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro has not gone away because we introduced servers. The fact that we now have web services did not negate the need for somebody to be able to go in and, using the professional desktop application, create great looking maps, do all the analysis and so forth. That became more important than ever. Servers don't go away just because we're now talking about Web GIS, ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise. No, what powers everything under the hood are still your same data sets. They're just becoming more important than ever. And now when we start talking about that next step, distributed GIS, I have more than one instance of my GIS. My GIS lives both on premises, in the cloud, in ArcGIS Online. Maybe I'm interacting with other organizations and their GIS implementations. Well, that just means that each one of those implementations become more important than ever themselves. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shannon, and we'll talk more about what? Can you give us an idea?
Yeah, so this staircase diagram that Philip just presented, here's how Jack presented it in the plenary, where we go from desktop to server GIS, enterprise and online, which is obviously the web GIS, and then distributed GIS. Now, what Philip and I are talking about in this session is enterprise and online. And obviously, there are sessions going on throughout the conference that covers each evolutionary step along this way, each part of the journey. Now, Philip was talking about how one doesn't replace the other. Obviously, since all of you are using desktop and then wearing those multiple hats, and I feel it. I was there too, not 2-3 years ago. I was a GIS analyst installing software, making web maps, making print maps, because those are still, we do that all the time. Considering what kind of blue looks good out of a plotter, those are careful considerations. Won't touch on that in this session. But there is one thing that we want to point out. There's a pattern where people use server GIS by itself. This is a big part of ArcGIS Enterprise, servers. But the idea of using it just by itself with things like a Flex Viewer, Silverlight, that's not necessarily what the whole grander picture of Web GIS is all about. We'll of course continue to support it, so you don't have to worry about that going away, because it's absolutely not. We understand that everyone's at a different part of their journey to that modern GIS that Jack described. But all of the new capabilities that we're putting into the software, like the new analytical capability, every time you hear someone say big data analytics or real-time analytics, that's all part of ArcGIS Enterprise. And those things are part of the Web GIS capabilities, not the standalone server implementation that you might have today. So that's something that you definitely want to be thinking about, is moving from that standalone server, maybe even if you were using a standalone server with ArcGIS Online, but moving fully over into a Web GIS pattern where you're using the full ArcGIS Enterprise-based deployment, which we'll talk about in that intro session that I'm giving later today. And also, there's a great demo theater happening twice this week in Demo Theater 8 about building your first ArcGIS Enterprise deployment that will cover it in even more detail. But this is where we want to start seeing you move to. It's really about that equivalency of core Web GIS functionality that you have in ArcGIS Online with the additional analytical capabilities that ArcGIS Enterprise and all of our servers can bring to you. So ArcGIS is all about systems. Jack talked about the system of systems when he talked about distributed GIS. When I think about Web GIS in all of our systems, I equate it most to a system of engagement. A system of engagement is simply what it exactly sounds like, a place where you're engaging with people, the users. You're getting information out and putting it in. Now, this image that you see here is how you would generally set that up, from creating identities to the end goal of creating and sharing content. We have other sessions that explain each step along that way and how you do it. But what I wanted to point out to you is some things that you might want to consider. So when you're creating identities, think about how you will be managing the onboarding of these users, not just things like training, like Philip pointed out earlier, but where are they actually coming from? Do you have identities stored in an Active Directory or an LDAP? If you're using ArcGIS Online, are you wanting to have any sort of SAML, yes. So these are things that you want to consider on if you're going to be creating built-in users, if you're going to be importing them. This is something that, as those more administrator, developer type scenarios, you want to be considering. You also want to consider who they are. In the What's New session, we're going to touch on this idea of named user levels. And we have two of them, a level 1 and a level 2. We won't get into what those do specifically in this session, but basically, that's your first decision you make about the people who will actually be using your Web GIS. Are they going to be just viewing the data? Are they someone out in the field that you want to be interacting with the Web GIS, adding content, creating it? Are they someone like you, yourselves, your coworkers, your colleagues, who need high privileges to be able to create rich content that's going to be inspiring and useful to your entire organization? Then obviously the roles. What do you want to think about here? Well, we expand from just the simple level 1, level 2, and then start thinking about permissions and access. Your identity and your role is the baseline of securing the content within a Web GIS, whether it's ArcGIS Online or it's ArcGIS Enterprise. So the role that you create, we have several built-in ones. You also can create custom roles. And then the way you decide there is think about how do you expect people to be using the system. A role might simply be something where you think, oh, I just need to decide for access purposes. But it also ties into how you architect your overall system. If your system is going to be used heavily by simultaneous power users, the number of instances of you have of a server, number of nodes you might have in a site might change, versus if you have a lot of people who are just going to be viewing content, because that's a very lightweight activity to just click layers on and off. Whenever you think about creating groups, think about how you're going to want that content organized. A lot of times when users are first getting started, they get so excited about Web GIS that you don't think about the implications of properly organizing your data. And so then when it comes time to sharing or grouping content so that people can find it and use it, this is especially true if you're trying to work with sources of truth or your authoritative data. Think about how you're going to group that so that you can become that source of authority, so that your users can obviously identify which parts of the Web GIS apply to them. And that makes the sharing of the content a much smoother process. So these are the same sessions that Philip mentioned earlier. If you're just at the getting started with ArcGIS Enterprise stage, go to the intro session. But if you're more advanced and needing to make those considerations like, well, how many cores of a server do I need in a base deployment for a hosting server? Or how do I scale a portal? I mean, well, these are big questions, and these are the decisions that make those nines that Philip talked about, which is just the amount of uptime. I mean, 99.9% uptime sounds pretty great, but it can go so much deeper than that, where 5 nines, that's maybe just seconds of downtime. That's crazy.
It's very expensive.
And expensive, but crazy. So those will be things that we talk about more deeply in the architecting session. Okay, so what does it take to be successful? It's not just the technology. Philip talked a lot about that technology in ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise. We do as much as we can within the software or our SaaS offering to make you successful out of the gate. But there's some things we just can't engineer into the software. And that's the part where you need to step in and become that champion within your organization. Deciding the process that end users, the non-GIS folk and GIS folk alike, will be partaking in whenever they're interacting with and using the Web GIS. Think about the people. Who is it that is using this, and how are they doing that? Who needs to be at the table as you're planning this? Planning is one of the most crucial parts, and unfortunately, as I'm sure you all know, it's something that is never finished. We're never done planning. As soon as you think you've got it, here comes a director or a coworker or a colleague, or even someone like Apple and Steve Jobs that says something that changes all of our great planning, and we have something new. Now, the cool thing with Web GIS is that you get to be able to be so much more agile than you could have been before, because we build things on our modern APIs and SDKs to help you make that pivot transition when some new technology comes on to be a much smoother process. So these are the sort of things you're going to want to consider. I know when I was a GIS analyst, one of the biggest concerns I had whenever I was working with an organization that was very nervous about moving into this Web GIS were my fellow existing GIS analysts. They were concerned because their whole careers had been based on print maps and doing things by hand. And along comes Web GIS with self-service mapping and the ability to make this thoughtful process, like I talked about picking the shade of blue, into something that happens instantaneously within the software itself. But the role of the GIS professional in Web GIS is just as important, if not more, than it has been at any time before. You're still curating content and authoring maps, but now you're also taking the extra step and configuring and developing apps. And the cool thing is that whether you know code or not, there is an app, as Philip pointed out, for you. So if you're ready to challenge yourself to go a little bit further, to bring something new to your organization, there's plenty of room to grow. GIS is such an exciting field for me because there is so much opportunity, and Web GIS is a great gateway for that. So everything you do as a GIS professional is going to feed into your greater organization, to the people that are the knowledge workers, your executives, the people in the field, the people doing operation, and even analysts that have roles outside of GIS. Maybe you're at a public safety organization, you have intelligence and counterterrorism, or maybe you're at an oil company and you're working with geotechs. Whatever the situation is, your GIS affects so much more than just you in the GIS team. So speaking of that, how do we increase the effectiveness? We as GIS professionals obviously have our GIS teams. Hopefully we're all feeling pretty good about what we're doing GIS, but even at our very best, sometimes we can only reach a small portion of the whole overall organization. And when we do that, that's not being as effective as we could be. So the best strategy that we recommend is to try to secure executive sponsorship. Find that director, find that manager that's going to champion the GIS and see the value of it. And we all know exactly what GIS can do to bring that value. I mean, we make the maps that run the world. That's what they said in the plenary, and we know it's absolutely true. That the information that we can provide through Web GIS is fast, dynamic, it helps speed decision making, and it puts everything together in one place with a lot of work from people like you. So once you get that, secure that executive sponsorship, you can really saturate your organization and really make your organization geo-enabled, have them be able to use the systems, champion it, to where when they meet organizations that don't have the power of GIS and the science of where, they're surprised. And that's really what we want to do, is really make that something that we can help share and help people understand the data and context of the information around them. I really liked that quote that we got in the plenary, that information doesn't always inform and questions aren't always a quest. That's so true when it comes to GIS. And what we're doing through Web GIS especially is helping people on the first step of their journey of the informed quest. Okay, so Philip explained some of the reasons why you would pick ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. And this is the diagram you saw. Now, below the dotted line is infrastructure you control, whether it's a machine on premises or an instance in the cloud. And above the dotted line is ArcGIS Online. Now, just to recap, to make sure we really are hammering it home, the two can work together really great. But what might drive your organization one place or the other is those functional requirements. So if you do need those advanced analytical capabilities that you get through any of the server roles of ArcGIS Enterprise, that would drive you to have an ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. Or if you have security policies that might be pushing you to be unable to use a SaaS-based offering that is in infrastructure that you don't manage, again, that might make you want to use ArcGIS Enterprise. Aside from that, you might also be, like as Philip mentioned, having people work out in the public or be field workers. Field workers as in a mobile workforce. But as you saw in the plenary, there are people actually literally working in fields empowered with GIS. Planting shellfish.
So one of the really fascinating things for me about what we're trying to convey on this slide is really that those considerations that go into how do I choose going up or down on the spectrum, online or enterprise, or left to right. And the up to down is very much about the functionality in many ways. There's a lot of advanced functionality that you find on the lower half, but there's also functionality that only exists in ArcGIS Online today, like those utility services, routing, geocoding, things that would take a lot of effort to do in your own infrastructure. There's also things like open data that you find on the online side. So you really need to understand the capabilities you're looking for. What are the workflows that you're trying to address, and see, does that push you up or down, or is it more agnostic? No, I simply need to use collector. I could install the software. I could use online. It doesn't really matter. Then it becomes more a question of going left to right. Many organizations these days have a SaaS or cloud first type of initiative. Who wants to be in the business of installing and maintaining IT infrastructure? Fairly few people, at least outside of IT departments. That will naturally start pushing you towards the left-hand side of the diagram. On the other hand, if you simultaneously have something that pushes you towards the left but also pushes you down functionality-wise, that's where you start ending up in that combined tier of both online and enterprise. If you're in a disconnected environment, there's no such thing as the internet, whether for security or policy reasons or simply geographic reasons. There's no good internet connection. Well, that makes it easy. You just get pushed to the far right of this diagram.
I think that's a really key point. Web GIS does not mean you have to have the open internet. Web GIS exists completely disconnected from the open internet. So that's an excellent point to bring up. So as we're moving through that planning phase, here's some questions you want to consider. What is your deployment environment? If it's on-premise and you're limited to that, then you're looking at ArcGIS Enterprise. But if the cloud is an option, you can consider one or both. What tools are going to help you streamline the deployment? You don't have to do it by hand anymore. As Julia presented in the plenary, we have lots of tools. Things like Builder, Chef, and cloud tools for both Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services. And then what analytical capabilities do you need? Are the core WebGIS functionality tools enough for the users of your WebGIS? If so, ArcGIS Online is looking like a great option. But if you need additional analytical capabilities within your Web GIS, then that would be something that you would want to consider ArcGIS Enterprise for. Things like big data analytics, which you would get through GeoAnalytics Server, or raster analysis that you get through the image server, which are both part of ArcGIS Enterprise. Then, how do you expect ArcGIS Enterprise to be used? This gets at how you're going to want to architect your deployment. Are you expecting power users? Are you expecting mostly viewers? Even if you have a very large organization, that might not necessarily mean you have to have oodles and oodles and oodles of cores. You just have to start to think about where it is that you need to scale and how to do that in the way that's going to make the most sense. And then lastly, those 9s that we talked about, the SLA. How much uptime do you need? 99.9 is a great amount, and that's what you can get with ArcGIS Online. If your organization needs more or wants to have greater control over the infrastructure, that's where you would start to consider ArcGIS Enterprise. So now some quick tips for success. We all wear many hats, but it's very hard to be an expert DBA, an expert IT administrator, a GIS professional, the GIS manager, and every other thing that you're doing, the developer. Y'all raise your hands on that too. So use the resources you have within your organizations. Help them understand so that way you can scale and grow. You want to, oh, there, my animations happen too. You want to plan and prepare to scale your deployment. So maybe you get started and you're just running a simple, small deployment, maybe just the base deployment set up with ArcGIS Enterprise Builder. But as your Web GIS has gained traction and more people are logging on to use it, well, then it's time to grow that. Not only maybe the diversity and the analytical capabilities you offer, maybe you're adding new server roles, but the quantity of cores you have with each of those as well. And then thinking of things of high availability, security. Philip will cover so much of this in the architecting session, so we'll stop because it could literally, there's a whole session on it.
It could take 75 minutes.
It could. Then find more champions. So much of the time as the GIS analyst, we kind of become that GIS expert, but I know that I've been put in situations as a GIS analyst where I didn't know the answer, where an engineer came to me and said, hey, the pipe wall thickness on this map says that it's some amount of decimal places, but this is a pipe made of some substance. Why is it saying this? And I thought, boy, I do not know. But I can tell you that geographically speaking, as our data is, it is correct. But that's something where you want to champion those, to have that greater value in the information. Someone that can look at the content and do more with it and make more with it. This will also help you to make apps that solve those specific problems. I feel like, especially in the age of the Silverlight and Flex viewers, there was this idea of putting everything that you could possibly have into one application, one Mapzilla, if you will, the Godzilla of maps applications.
I'm going to ask one more question by show of hands, and it's okay if you don't want to raise your hand. How many of you can recognize that in your organization?
I worked on one.
Exactly,
I helped build
right.
it.
We've all built them. I've built them. It's okay. I love this part. I truly love this slide because that's such an important thing to start getting away from.
Yes, so that all of the configurable apps, it's starting to answer those specific problems. Because really, if you create those Mapzillas, 80% of the people are only going to be using 20% of that functionality. So rather than have them inundated with all those options and buttons and widgets, create the apps that make sense for them. And within a Web GIS type infrastructure, it makes it so much easier for us to manage those as GIS professionals. So it doesn't become an obstacle of, well, but then there's this code, and well, now I have to consider this. Your portal is where you do all that. Makes it very easy. And then I want you to think about where our industry started. Back in the day with dudes wearing glasses and way spiffier than I feel like a lot of people have to dress at work, contemplating paper maps. There's this idea that Web GIS sometimes can't be beautiful, and that's so insane to me. Look at the beautiful things you saw in the plenary. So bring that art of cartography that we were trained in, that we know, that you can learn and embrace and expand in, and bring that into your Web GIS. Don't underestimate the power of good design. And if you need some inspiration and you need some ideas, go back and look. On our Esri website, we have some maps that we love. Some of these you saw, like the Tactile Atlas of Switzerland, was printed out in the map gallery. But there are so many apps and maps that are there for you to explore and discover and take ideas home from. Use them, learn from them. And as you're developing this, we have those configurable templates. You don't have to stop at what's the default configuration. If your organization has greater needs, has more requirements, you can customize those further, like the City of LA did here. They updated the styling and symbology of this map, tailored it to the workflow that they needed and to the data that they were using. So this is something that you can do as well to match your organization's color theme and branding, anything like that. Then show something new. So we're constantly adding innovations through mobile GIS and story maps, 3D, real time, and integration with things like Microsoft Office. So let's take a look at one of those that I think gets frequently overlooked, which is something like story maps. These have been around for years, story maps. And let's hop out of this. Hold on, technical difficulties here. There. So here we have a story map, and it's not the story map that we saw years ago. Here we have an animated GIF running in the back. If this was something you were trying to compel your organization or your stakeholders to do, all of a sudden, before they've even looked at the data, you're setting the stage. And the beautiful, beautiful story map unfolds before you, where you can see things like support packages being dropped by planes. You can embed videos, your maps, photos. It's something that makes it a much richer presentation to your users. So let's go back. So take a look at that and find inspiration in there to be able to do more with the apps and maps, because all of our data tells a story. So it's definitely something that we can always bring to our organizations. And then we want to make sure that with our Web GIS, we monitor it. Just like the planning process is never finished, neither is our jobs when it comes to monitoring our Web GIS. It's certainly not something that we can set and forget. So remember that we have to maintain those SLAs, the uptime that we have. You want to continue to have transparency into your system. Know what you're doing, where, and why. You want to consider things like your network, the hardware, your web servers, everything down to your RDBMS. You want to be able to plan for change, because ultimately we all know that that is something that's inevitable. But as we're planning, there are some things that are easy for us to go for. And that's that low-hanging fruit, things that have a high organizational impact and are relatively easy for us to get done. Sometimes whenever we have a long list of requirements, it does get difficult to prioritize. So go for those first, get some of those easy wins, and then build up to the more complicated and more challenging problems.
And I think that goes really well with the example that Shannon just showed and the story maps. There's so many things we can do within the modern GIS platform today that doesn't require a lot of work once the underlying infrastructure is in place. If you need to secure that executive sponsorship, if you need to show something new, you can go for some of these quick wins first without a massive amount of effort. That can be the beachhead on which you build upon to then start justifying why this is important. Show something very concrete. Show something really cool looking and new and different. Do you know how little effort it took for me to get this map to show up on your iPad on the great looking Explorer application that we just installed? There you go. And then start seeding the idea of what can actually be done with this platform and go from there.
So that's the end of our presentation. Feel free, please, and we encourage you to take our survey on our Esri Events app. It's very easy now.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. And while we take those questions, let me go back to one of these core slides without breaking the video entirely. And open it up to the audience. Otherwise, before everybody walks out, thank you so much for coming.
Yes.
We've got lots of sessions on online and enterprise. To kind of start the conversation, and hopefully some of you do have comments or questions on this, I want to leave you with this slide and just make you think about those functional requirements pushing you up or down, and those more non-functional policy things that may be pushing you towards SaaS-based solutions, on-prem solutions, depending on where you are. I think that's really the key of where we want to go. So let's start up here in front.
My understanding that early effort, you made the recommendation against utilizing both ArcGIS Enterprise and Online. But it's my understanding that those entities end up being two separate portals, and there's both licensing, user management, and content management duplication of effort related to doing that. So as that recommendation, what's the way that you take on that particular level of effort? Is there another session available to us to talk about that work? I understand there's work being done for portal communication down the road, but I don't have a timeline for that. And so can you speak a little bit to that?
So let me repeat and try to paraphrase the question. You can tell me if I'm butchering it too much. The question, the comment is more around the fact that, well, early on I said you can use both online and enterprise. So when you do that, there's a whole host of considerations that go into that by itself. Part of it is on the licensing side of things. Part of it is now I have two systems. I may only be installing and maintaining one of them. The other one just happens to be there. But now I've got content that may be in one, not the other, or it's in both. How do I keep all of this under control? And then there's the aspect of user management. Now, do my users have a login to both systems? How do I take care of all of these different things? So that's a very broad question, and you're completely correct. All of those things are things to keep in mind. That's also part of this understanding of, is that an appropriate choice for me? I am taking on different responsibilities when I have multiple systems. On the technical side, like you mentioned, we do have a lot of new functionality in the area of collaboration between different systems that have come in with 10.5 and 10.5.1. So that's something that we're very focused on and doing a lot of work on within the product itself. With ArcGIS Enterprise 10.5, we introduced enterprise-to-enterprise collaboration. 10.5.1 that just came out a couple of weeks ago along with the online update introduced collaboration between enterprise and online. So that starts to get at how do I manage my content? Content that originates in one system I want to make discoverable in the other system, or maybe I even want to replicate the entire content over to the other system for lots of different purposes. So that's mostly on the content side. On the user side, it depends a little bit on your particular setup. Do you have a single sign-on system? If you're using enterprise logins or SAML, then it's fairly straightforward to use the same identity provider for both, and your users get the experience of, I'm just using my regular login, I don't need to learn yet another username and password. It's fairly seamless. And then it gets back to the question of the user accounts on both sides and some of the licensing aspects. And that's where I always have to say that is a conversation to be had outside of the realm of this particular session. But we're definitely very focused on making it easier to have multiple systems within the product. There's a lot of attention to that. We've introduced in 10.5.1 the enterprise and online collaboration. The online aspect of that is an early adopter today, but all of you are invited. It's an open early adopter program, so if you are interested in doing enterprise and online collaboration, let us know and we can get you in touch with the people managing that particular program. We expect it to go final and be simply turned on for all online organizations by the end of the year. We had a question here in the back. Sure. So the comment in a nutshell is essentially there's a large element of cost. I've talked about functional requirements. I've talked about policy regulations that might push you one way or another. But cost is certainly also an important metric to look at. And it's not just direct licensing costs necessarily like we just talked about. On the lower half of the spectrum, ArcGIS Enterprise, now there's infrastructure cost. I need to buy servers, or I need to pay Amazon or Microsoft or whoever it might be for machines, virtual machines, something. I need to pay IT people to actually run and maintain the system. None of that is free, obviously. So that's a large part of why many organizations these days do have that SaaS first, if possible, trend, because that gets you out of the business of having to deal with all of that. It's not something that I think that we can answer, but simply acknowledge that that is certainly the case. As soon as you're dealing with software, that you need to install, maintain, and run that software somewhere by somebody.
Can you have totally anonymous access to an ArcGIS Online map without having to sign in? If we link from our web page to a map that we've got an ArcGIS Online.
That's the easiest question so far.
Yes.
The question is, can you have totally anonymous access to an ArcGIS Online map if you're linking from a web page? The answer is yes, absolutely.
Nobody has to sign in.
You don't need to sign in. There's an option.
You need to share it with everyone, though.
Right.
So when you do that, it means that anyone that can log in, that can hit that URL, can see it. So don't have the expectation that it's just your organization or just the people you want.
It's literally called share with everyone. And when we're talking ArcGIS Online, everyone is literally everyone with an internet connection. When we're talking ArcGIS Enterprise, it's anybody who has access to wherever that deployment is running. In the back.
So with ArcGIS Server, you have the ability on our site, it's all single sign-on, and we have our custom role providers, so we have like 30,000 users, several thousand users, right? So that's all provided in ArcGIS Servers. So the group data stays autonomous to that group. With Portal, it's all built in groups, and so that makes it a challenge because either you have to customize it so that the groups get automated as needed, and get created as needed based off of those custom groups, and somehow maintain control of the data for those individual groups. So like in an organization, you have the org chart and you have all the individuals. That's not the reality. The reality is that organizations decide what the different groupings are and they put people into those groups, right? So is there anything going to change in regard to Portal to allow for an organizational grouping of the information? Because right now it's all built in.
So I'll try to repeat and paraphrase. Essentially, in previous releases, or with ArcGIS Server by itself, standalone ArcGIS Server, the technology allowed for different types of group and user integration. Among others, we had the model where you could create custom integration points. When we're looking at ArcGIS Enterprise and essentially the introduction of the portal component, we have the technology is different. It's similar in what it's ultimately trying to do, but the underlying tech works in a different way. We do support the idea of built-in, which is just you're creating user accounts and groups within the portal itself, but we also do support integrating out to external systems. So with Portal, when you're using ArcGIS Enterprise, you can connect out to LDAP and Active Directory-based groups. What we don't have is the custom group provider.
Yeah, we don't use Active Directory groups.
Right. So So that's where it's a little bit more interesting. We don't have the same custom group integration points with Portal, so that's something we should talk about. I'm curious. We haven't heard a whole lot of that. I think last question.
Yeah, regarding data streaming, is there anything ArcGIS Online support, or that is something still you need to put to a processor?
Real-time data streaming.
Yeah.
Okay. Today, ArcGIS Online does not have real-time capabilities. That's something that you find within ArcGIS Enterprise as part of Geo Event Server. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.